Hey everyone, and welcome to Dear Mr. Potter. I'm Alistair Stevens. Tonight, in the 9th session of our 3rd season, we get to the big reveals of Azkaban, and our plot turns toward its climax. In chapters 17 and 18, we are dragged, some of us literally kicking and screaming, to the Shrieking Shack. I have a problem with my mouth in that when I say the phrase Shrieking Shack, I want to insert an extra R. So I more often than not say Shrieking Shrack. That's not what the place is called. It's called the Shrieking Shack. I'll just try and do better with that, I guess. We are going to learn more about Sirius Black. We're going to learn more about Remus Lupin, about Peter Pettigrew, and one James Potter. A lot of our plots are going to be advanced tonight. Many of our plots are going to be resolved tonight. And we are going to set the stage for our final climax here in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Before we get to that, I want to thank personally and effusively the wonderful Leslie McAdoo Gordon, who sent me, let me close this video and show you this wonderful thing. This is a Marauders map mug, which is normally a jet black mug, a mug with no sign of its nefarious activities. But when you pour hot water into it and presumably intone the marvelous phrase, "I solemnly swear I am up to no good," the Marauders map is revealed. It's pretty cool. Thank you, Leslie, for that. That's going to keep me company through the rest of Dear Mr. Potter. Let's see. Melissa says, JK, can we call it the Cackling Cabin instead? That would be great, right? And Jamie has a similar mug. That's fantastic. And Becca is asking if Skipa is joining us tonight because it is her birthday. I don't think that Skipa is with us. It is the middle of the night in Scotland. So Skipa is, probably busy with other things, not least of all her celebratory scotch for that aforementioned birthday. Skipa, I hope you're listening to the podcast version of this after the fact. A very happy birthday to you. Let's talk a little, before we get into the details of these chapters, about exposition. Exposition is a burden with which every single storyteller must wrestle. From time to time, no matter how skillfully you show rather than tell, you're going to need to have one character explain the plot to another and, incidentally, to the reader. Sometimes information does have to be exposed. You must exposit. That is an exposition scene. Sometimes when exposition scenes are handled badly, it can feel like you're being caught in a deluge. It can feel as though you're getting a lot of information and not actual advancement of the plot. That is what often leads to the scenes that are colloquially known as info dump scenes. And a particularly challenging load-bearing scene is sometimes referred to as a hell scene. I need to have my protagonist explain the entire history of the small town where she lives to her brand new boyfriend. That's a hell scene. I need to have my detective lay out the exact convoluted mechanism by which this murder took place. That is a hell scene. I have to take an entire chapter to have Remus Lupin explain the plot of the novel to Harry and Ron and Hermione while Sirius Black simultaneously criticizes him for expositing. That is a hell scene. That is the hellest hell scene. That is a nightmare to write and oftentimes very, very difficult to read. I do not think that this is a difficult scene to read. It is not perhaps an unqualified success, but by leaning deep into her characterization, by engaging directly with the characters who we have come to love over the course of the preceding 2 novels and what we've had so far of Prisoner of Azkaban, J.K. Rowling manages to deliver this exposition in a way that is absolutely rooted in character. It's not, admittedly, rooted in plot. We spend a lot of time in this scene with our characters at a stalemate, simply sitting opposite each other and delivering exposition and asking the necessary questions. And then, because this is a fantasy story and we have to establish the rules of the world, picking at those explanations and saying, well, yes, but why not this? Why not that? Why isn't this obviously the case? Well, because it needs to not be the case for the plot, but also here is the Band-Aid explanation. Here is why these events have unfolded in exactly the way that they have. So this is demanding. And certainly if I had looked at the outline of Prisoner of Azkaban before J.K. Rowling had written it, the first thing that I would have said is, yeah, but we're going to move the exposition out of that one scene, right? We're going to take the exposition out and kind of spread it out through the back half of the 2nd act. We definitely don't want this nightmare scene where all of our subplots crash into each other, and all of our subplots, pretty much, there are a couple of very minor exceptions, but pretty much all of our subplots crash into one another in this scene, and none of them are left changed. Sirius Black and Lupin and Peter Pettigrew and the Marauders map and the Marauders themselves and Crookshanks and Scabbers and the Whomping Willow and the Shrieking Shack itself All of these subplots are now in play. Even the invisibility cloak, you can argue, which has been a recurring subplot through the previous 2 books, is now altered. Our understanding of that plot device is now irrevocably changed. And to do all of that in one scene, while more or less keeping the energy up, more or less keeping the reader engaged, this is a testament to J.K. Rowling's skill, you guys. And there are a couple of elements in this chapter, in these chapters. By this chapter, I'm basically talking about the second half of tonight's reading, which is the real hell scene. But in tonight's reading, there are a couple of moments that bespeak a profound mastery of her narrative art, I think. J.K. Rowling is arguably never more impressive than when she's delving deep into the history of her characters, deep into their deepest motivations, and we get a lot of that tonight. So let's get into it. And of course, through all of this, we're dealing with our ongoing themes of crime and of punishment, of civility and of savagery, of the human and the inhuman, in kind of both senses of the word, both senses of both words, I suppose, and so on. This is a very thematically dense and thematically textured deconstruction of all that has occurred in the novel so far, but we're still keeping those thematic balls in the air. We're still progressing our understanding of what crime and punishment mean in the wizarding world, for example. There are a couple of deceptively subtle lines which indicate J.K. Rowling's perspective on this and kind of arouse within us an emotional response to these ongoing themes and discussions. So there's just a ton of doing it. Joseph says literally 8% of this chat is in Wellington, New Zealand at this point. I'm just saying, are you looking at the analytics, Joseph? That's always very good. If you click the little analytics button at the bottom, you can see exactly where everyone is. Yes, no, you're right. 40 people here, 2 of them in Wellington, New Zealand. Hello to New Zealand. I have no idea what time it is in New Zealand right now. Thank you for joining me. Oh, I should say too, on the subject of times, that Joseph says, no, I just know those people. That's very cool, actually. But yes, you can also click. I think you all have access to the analytics tablets at the bottom of your screen. I should say, too, that we're approaching the end of our discussion of The Prisoner of Azkaban, and I definitely want to have one more session in which we are going to discuss this book at a more Europe-friendly time, so stay tuned, basically, for that. I don't think it's going to be next week, but I also don't want it to be the last session, so we'll see what we can do. There is also going to be, within the next few weeks, a live tweet, live chat, live discussion of some sort of the movie prior to our discussion here in the final session of season 3. So yeah, stay tuned over at pointnorthmedia.com. If you head on over to pointnorthmedia.com and you sign up for the newsletter, then you will get an announcement at the beginning of every week about each of the live sessions that is going to take place that week with an up-to-date time. You can also visit pointnorthmedia.com and click the podcasts button up at the top. Down at the bottom of that page, you will see the live calendar, which is as up-to-date as anything is. Whenever there's a schedule change, that is where it is reflected first. So you can even subscribe to that calendar on your mobile device of choice, and then you'll get push notifications half an hour before we go live, which is pretty great. You can also follow me here on Crowdcast, and that will also, I believe, send you notifications at some user-determinable period of time before the session begins. With all of that said, let's get into our discussion. I guess maybe you guys don't have the analytics. I do apologize for that. That must just be on my screen. I must have access to that. But yes, I can open a little window here that tells me how many people are attending live and where they're all attending from, and what else can I see here? Chat activity and who's tweeted the most and all of that stuff. It's pretty great. It's pretty good. I kind of like Crowdcast, you guys, and I'm very pleased that the transition to this platform is working out as well as it is. With all of that said, let's get into our first slide here and talk a little about Ron and Hermione in the aftermath of Ron, Hermione, and Harry, of course, in the aftermath of Buckbeak's execution. Harry and Hermione almost fell over Ron. They skidded to a stop right in front of him. He was sprawled on the ground, but Scabbers was back in his pocket. He had both hands held tight over the quivering lump. "Ron, come on, back under the cloak," Hermione panted. "Dumbledore, the minister, they'll be coming back out in a minute." But before they could cover themselves again, before they could even catch their breath, they heard the soft pounding of gigantic paws. Something was bounding toward them, quiet as a shadow, an enormous, pale-eyed, jet-black dog. Harry reached for his wand, but too late. The dog had made an enormous leap, and the front paws hit him in the chest. He keeled over backward in a whirl of hair. He felt its hot breath, saw inch-long teeth, but the force of its leap had carried it too far. It rolled off him. Dazed, feeling as though his ribs were broken, Harry tried to stand up. He could hear it growling as it skidded around for a new attack. Ron was on his feet. As the dog sprang back toward them, he pushed Harry aside. The dog's jaws fastened instead around Ron's outstretched arm. Harry lunged forward. He seized a handful of the brute's hair, but it was dragging Ron away as easily as if he were a rag doll. Then, out of nowhere, something hit Harry so hard across the face he was knocked off his feet again. He heard Hermione shriek with pain and fall too. Harry groped for his wand, blinking blood out of his eyes. "Lumos," he whispered. The wand light showed him the trunk of a thick tree. They had chased Scabbers into the shadow of the Whomping Willow, and its branches were creaking as though in a high wind, whipping backward and forward to stop them going nearer. Back to the Whomping Willow, you guys. One of my favorite returning elements here in J.K. Rowling's creation. So, fleeing from Buckbeak, we have Scabbers losing control of himself, certainly newly desperate, trying to escape from Ron. We have that moment of recovery when Ron recaptures Scabbers and thrusts him back into a pocket, covering him with both hands. But all at once, the large black dog is upon us. And this is the first time that we have transitioned away from the black dog being a specter, being an omen, either literal or metaphorical, of Harry's uncertain fate. Now the black dog is physical, it is present, it is here, and it is attacking, and Harry is, of course, terrified. I mean, all of our power trio are terrified in this moment, and things are about to get more frightening still. The black dog drags Ron beneath the Whomping Willow, and through a mysterious tunnel, Harry and Hermione give chase, and eventually find themselves in the Shrieking Shack itself. Karen says, one of the things I really love about this episode is the use of the geography of Hogwarts and Hogsmeade. Even if it doesn't quite parse spatially, it really adds to the narrative. Yes. Yes, it really does. I like the way that we are reusing established elements. And there's no sense in which the Whomping Willow is necessary for this final conclusion. Had this battle taken place elsewhere, had we not returned to the Whomping Willow as a narrative element, the Whomping Willow, of course, introduced in Chamber of Secrets, then we wouldn't, I think, have missed it necessarily. We don't feel as though this is an unresolved beat. And this is how you layer effective foreshadowing into your text. If something is introduced and then left fallow, then the reader is primed to anticipate a certain purpose. The reader is primed to anticipate a certain utility. That is to say that we expect the conservation of detail. If something is mentioned, if something is plot significant, then it is important. And if it hasn't served a purpose yet, we expect it to serve that purpose later in the story. Otherwise, why did you tell us about it in the first place? And J.K. Rowling is generally a master at this, because she will introduce an element and have it serve a superficial purpose, have it serve an immediate purpose. That is to say that the Whomping Willow within the frame of this book would have served its purpose if all it had done was destroy Harry's broomstick and necessitate the firebolt and the story that sprang forth from that. But here it is again. It is now an established part of the world building. We know now what to expect from the Whomping Willow, and even now it is itself subverted. We're going to get more information as we move into the Shrieking Shack. Yeah. Let me see. Chekhov's Whomping Willow, says Ryan Kearns. Yes, that you would not want this Whomping Willow on your mantle. It's true. Good. All right, let's move into our second slide here as we move into the shack itself. He and Hermione paused, gasping for breath, edging forward. Both raised their wands to see what lay beyond. It was a room, a very disordered, dusty room. Paper was peeling from the walls. There were stains all over the floor. Every piece of furniture was broken as though somebody had smashed it. The windows were all boarded up. Harry glanced at Hermione, who looked very frightened, but nodded. Harry pulled himself out of the hole, staring around. The room was deserted, but a door to their right stood open, leading to a shadowy hallway. Hermione suddenly grabbed Harry's arm again. Her wide eyes were traveling around the boarded windows. "Harry," she whispered, "I think we're in the Shrieking Shack." Harry looked around. His eyes fell on a wooden chair near them. Large chunks had been torn out of it. One of the legs had been ripped off entirely. "Ghosts didn't do that," he said slowly. At that moment, there was a creak overhead. Something had moved upstairs. Both of them looked up at the ceiling. Hermione's grip on Harry's arm was so tight he was losing feeling in his fingers. He raised his eyebrows at her. She nodded again and let go. Quietly as they could, they crept out into the hall and up the crumbling staircase. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust except the floor, where a wide, shiny stripe had been made by something being dragged upstairs. It is perhaps appropriate, as we are approaching Halloween here, as we are in the middle of the month of October, that this sequence be as spooky as it is. The Shrieking Shack, I think, is a very effective piece of world building from J.K. Rowling. And arguably, as I discussed earlier with the Whomping Willow, she's kind of failed in the narrative demand here to have the Shrieking Shack play a significant role earlier in the story. It provides a backdrop, crucially, for Harry's tangle with Draco Malfoy, of course, when he's wearing the invisibility cloak. So it has been used, it has been accounted for, in a sense, narratively speaking, but we haven't resolved it. It has instead loomed as a kind of mystery over the rest of this narrative. And now we're about to get that mystery resolved. And this is one of the passages for me that works so much more effectively on subsequent reads than it does the first time I went through this book. Because the first time you go through this book, wow, yeah, this is really creepy. This is dusty and disordered, and everything has been destroyed. And we have evidence here of a prodigious, if not outright superhuman strength, the damage to the chair, the damage to the shack itself. And then we have that dusted streak across the floor, that polished streak across the floor of a body being dragged. And we are, of course, inclined to believe at this point that this is Ron, as it turns out to be. So it's very creepy. It's very spooky. We are now in an unfamiliar environment. And if you contrast the way in which the Shrieking Shack is introduced to us with the way that, say, the Chamber of Secrets is introduced to us, which is probably the closest parallel that we've had thus far in Harry Potter, then you'll see that it's a particularly effective piece of writing. It feels supernatural, even within the bounds of the wizarding world, because the Chamber of Secrets, for all of its Baroque architecture, for all of its kind of for all of its impressive geometry and utter secrecy, is very much of the wizarding world. But this is the first time that we've kind of pivoted away from that kind of encounter to something more mundane. What is spooky about the Shrieking Shack? Well, a very human kind of suffering, a very human kind of pain. There's nothing here that connects back to Salazar Slytherin. There's nothing here that is itself innately magic, though we should note that the Shrieking Shack probably is innately magical. That is to say, the windows are boarded up, but given the purpose of the Shrieking Shack, as it's revealed to us in just a few pages' time, it seems likely that those windows are magically reinforced to some degree. It has to act as a functional prison. And isn't that an important word at this point in Prisoner of Azkaban? Here we are again with our third, arguably fourth prison that we've kind of dealt with narratively, that we've folded into the narrative as it unfolds. What are the four prisons that we've seen so far in Prisoner of Azkaban? Well, Azkaban, obviously. And as we discussed way back at the beginning of the book, number 4, Privet Drive, the Dursleys, the mundane experience that Harry is forced to endure over the summer vacation. That is a prison all its own. But then through the bulk of the book, we've also turned Hogwarts into a kind of prison. Now there are trolls patrolling the hallways. There are, of course, Dementors patrolling the grounds. What was a safe escape from the mundane world for Harry has now become restricted, has now become limited itself. We could even argue that the Leaky Cauldron is a prison of a sort for Harry, that Diagon Alley is a prison of a sort for Harry right back at the beginning of the book. But throughout this book, we're dealing with people, mostly Harry, being incarcerated, being limited in their freedom, being limited in their ability to express themselves, to exert their will, to exert their agency. And that, of course, grows out of the boarding school adventure. Children are restricted. They're restricted for their own good. We're at Hogwarts for 5 minutes in the first book before we're told, oh, don't go into the Forbidden Forest. There's a reason we call it the Forbidden Forest. And yes, then immediately, detention. Get thee to the Forbidden Forest. That's, a silly whimsical piece of plot device in the first book there. But we're accustomed to the idea that some hallways are forbidden, that there is a restricted area in the library of Hogwarts. But now Hogwarts itself, something that was previously a beacon of hope and of comfort and of community, has been turned into something darker. And the shack itself, Is it a refuge? Yes. Yes, it absolutely is a refuge. But it's also a prison. It is specifically and explicitly designed to be a prison. It removes a person, an individual, which we'll discuss in a few pages' time, from his community. And it does that in order to safeguard that community, as all prisons, at least in theory, do. Why do we have Azkaban? Because some wizards just can't be allowed to walk through the world. Why is Harry with the Dursleys? Well, that's a better question, actually. But in part, it's because Harry just can't wander the world. He can't be completely at liberty, partly because he's a child and partly because he's Harry Potter. And he needs to be protected, even if it's by the Dursleys. Why is Hogwarts now a prison? Why is he held in the Leaky Cauldron, in Diagon Alley by extension? Why is Remus Lupin incarcerated in the Shrieking Shack? To protect community. This is the just act of a civil structure, right? This is society protecting itself. That is what Crime and Punishment, the whole kind of philosophical discussion of crime and punishment, is or should be primarily about. How does society preserve its greatest good? Well, sometimes by removing people from the context of that society. And sometimes removing people from the context of their society is simply an act of desperation. It's simply an act of last resort. It's not good. There is no good, but this is what there is. And of course, when we're talking about the Shrieking Shack, when we're talking about Remus Lupin, and we're talking about the Marauders, we're talking about an enclosed community. We're talking about a tighter community. We're talking about community of a different sort, a community that arises almost in opposition to established community. We'll talk more about that as we keep moving on. Yes, Brandon says, interesting observations about Sirius basically bouncing from prison to prison. Sirius has not left Azkaban behind. We're about to get very clear textual proof that that is the case, but he has not left Azkaban behind. He has escaped, but it's reading this chapter that I look again at the title on the front of the book and think, the Prisoner of Azkaban. Who is the Prisoner of Azkaban? Sirius Black. When is he the Prisoner of Azkaban? Well, it's not just in his time at Azkaban. He is still, now, in this chapter, very much a prisoner, because imprisonment is partly physical, but it is also about the judgment of one's community. Yes, he is no longer actually within the bounds of Azkaban. He is no longer actually a prisoner in that sense, but he is, to the same degree, an exile. He has been exiled from his community. And we'll see that partial reintegration with his community here. Yeah. Let me see here. Legend says, I love this live chat, but good God, I have to go back and re-listen to the podcast because I feel like I missed so much from Alistair while I'm talking with you all. Yeah, you know, that happens. It's a very different experience. I know most of the people joining me here tonight will listen to the podcast again after the fact, yes. This is more of a, you know, convivial kind of, you know, party atmosphere here in the live chat, which I think is one of the things that makes it so much fun. Yes, Princess Ostrich says, there was also the notion that in order to get security, freedom is lost, and vice versa. Yes, exactly right. This is part of the ongoing discussion, and very quietly will be part of the discussion for the rest of the series. You know, we're not done with Crime and Punishment after we're done with The Prisoner of Azkaban. We're going to return to this idea of the ways in which society seeks to define itself and protect itself for the rest of the series. That's going to be where J.K. Rowling eats for the rest of the series of Harry Potter. Yeah. Joseph asks in all caps, a depressing thought, do you ever leave Azkaban behind? Well, no, arguably not. And I think even textually, no, let me cancel the slide. I've had this slide up forever and I'm just talking to you all. Even textually not. Remember when Hagrid was talking about Azkaban? And obviously it's clear within the pages of Chamber of Secrets, as I've said before, that J.K. Rowling had not yet developed fully her idea for Azkaban. What is Azkaban in Chamber of Secrets? Wizard prison? That's all we need to know, really. It's a place where Hagrid is taken, and it's unjust that he be removed from Hogwarts, and yet also kind of practical. It's not just, but it is in a sense judicious that we remove Hagrid from Hogwarts toward the end of the Chamber of Secrets. Yes, of course, again, I will emphasize, it is unjust, but there is at least an argument. There isn't an argument for removing Hagrid from Hogwarts and sending him to Azkaban within the context of Prisoner of Azkaban and the rest of the series. Now that we know what Azkaban is, now that we know what happens to the people who are sent there, there is no justification for sending Hagrid there. But in this book, even he remembers what it was like to be there. Even he, gosh, you'll remember that harrowing passage when he talks about effectively wishing for death. He talks about wishing that it would all just come to an end. That is such an extraordinary response. That is such an excessive response from Cornelius Fudge to imprison Hagrid against his will. Yeah, we've talked about that obviously already, but it's tough. Yeah. Good. Okay. Outlander Pam asks an interesting and kind of broad question here. As many times as I've read this book, I've never got the crime and punishment aspect. Does this mean I'm shallow? No, absolutely not. This takes us back to, I suppose, the question of theme and applicability on the one hand, and allegory on the other. And I'm going to, segue into something that I've discussed a lot over in There and Back Again, the Tolkien series that I'm running over at Point North Media right now, because this is something of which, something about which J.R.R. Tolkien had very, very strong feelings indeed. If understanding the thematic framework for a book is necessary for you to enjoy that book, that is to say, if your experience of the book is incomplete unless you understand the kind of thematic statement that the book is making, that the author is making, then the book is weaker than it would otherwise be. It is more likely to be explicitly allegory. Can you enjoy 1984 without understanding the thematic allegorical thrust of 1984? Well, no, not really, because there isn't much to 1984 that isn't that. And this is not to say that allegory is inherently bad storytelling. It is to say, I suppose, that allegory is inherently bad narrative, right? That allegory does not require us to generate a completely consistent secondary world. It doesn't require us to tell a compelling story in and of itself, because what matters is the allegorical point of connection. It is the kind of the superstructure of allegory that we can map to this narrative, but which is really representative of another narrative, right? This is the problem that I have personally with some of the works of C.S. Lewis. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is excellent allegory. It's not great storytelling, because it is primarily, allegorical in nature. The Prisoner of Azkaban is not allegorical in nature. This is not a riddle that is to be solved. You cannot present to someone a paragraph-long thesis statement saying, no, but this is what Prisoner of Azkaban is about, and thereby render Prisoner of Azkaban unnecessary. There is no way to encapsulate the fullness and diversity of this work in a readily communicable fashion. And that means that Prisoner of Azkaban has to stand on its own. And arguably, as I have argued pretty much every week that we've been here, it does stand on its own. It is a compelling narrative in and of itself. And because it's a compelling narrative, you can be here for narrative reasons. You can get all of the emotional release, all of the emotional catharsis. You can get all of the emotional engagement from this story without ever thinking about its thematic elements at all, let alone the very specific element of crime and punishment in this book. Part of what I strive to do in this seminar series and in really all my work is to delve deeper into the text, okay? Let's look at what's really there. Let's look at what's really happening. Let's not be distracted by the kind of halo of supposition and assumption that surrounds any given text. Let's look at the story, observe how it works, celebrate how it works, and find these deeper connections that underlie the narrative arc itself. So I don't think that makes you a superficial person. I don't think it makes you a superficial reader. I don't think it makes you a bad reader. I think it's entirely possible to read Prisoner of Azkaban and not notice any of this stuff. Doesn't mean the stuff isn't there. Doesn't mean that the stuff isn't important or valuable, but it's not the only thing that is important and valuable. I'm generally reluctant to engage in the kind of critical discourse that presupposes that books are riddles to be solved, that presupposes that a novel is a puzzle box which we must break apart and analyze in order to understand. That is not how my favorite stories work. That is a conceit of literary fiction, and certainly some great stories have been written which do function in exactly that way. But for me, the emotional roller coaster, the deep world building, the emotional engagements, the emotional relationships between each of our primary characters, that's as good a reason as any to come to the work of J.K. Rowling and to come to this book in particular. Yeah. Let me catch up here with the chat. Yes, let me see. Princess Oster says, the frustrating thing is also the conclusion. In an allegory, it has to be an explicit statement. And then if you clash with the opinion of the reader, basically inevitable, the reader won't enjoy the ending. Perfect, right? That's absolutely true. Allegory has one defined interpretive meaning, and that's it. There is no space in allegory to discuss the death of the author. There is no space in allegory, and I know death of the author, capital D, capital A, kind of can can upset people because it feels as though we are removing the author from their position of primacy. We're not removing the author from their position of primacy. We're removing the author from their position of a kind of unilateral and tyrannical definitory role with regard to the text. It says that your interpretation of Prisoner of Azkaban is just as valid as J.K. Rowling's and just as valid as mine, just as valid as anyone's. If you read Prisoner of Azkaban, if you're reading Prisoner of Azkaban right now and you're thinking, yeah, this crime and punishment stuff, I just don't see it. I just don't get it. I don't think that it is there. I don't think that that is a valid interpretation, or I don't think that that is my interpretation. That's great. That's fantastic. That's exactly what the discourse surrounding books should be like. That's what the analysis of stories and storytelling should be like. I'm spending a lot of time on this, you guys. Let's get back to our slides here. Yes, because there's so much to discuss. As I scroll down here. Yeah, Angela Louise says, JKR doesn't bang you over the head with crime and punishment. It's just there if you dig deeper. Yes, I think that's true. And Elizabeth says, I also think that the best stories have puzzle boxes that the author never intended and are personal to the reader. So getting them right is impossible, as is getting them wrong. Beautifully put. I think you're entirely right. I think that, that there are moments of particular and specific emotional resonance that you will find within your favorite texts that do not stand in the same light or do not carry the same weight for other people, for other readers. That doesn't invalidate that response. Part of what Death of the Author tells us is that every response, every sincere and honest response is valuable and valid. And I think that's absolutely true. Yeah. Jackie says, I think the most upsetting thing about the way Sirius is treated throughout the series is that he's continually met with suspicion for being a criminal, for being immature when he's been through a seriously traumatic experience, charged with betraying his best friend and spending years in Azkaban. Yeah, we're going to talk about Sirius Black in subsequent books because yes, the guy has a tough life. He just has a tough life. There's really no way of getting around that. Melissa is taking bets on whether we'll get through both chapters. We absolutely will. Let's get to it. Okay. Because we've done 2 slides already and we're 45 minutes in. Let's do this thing. Our next slide. As I give that primacy here, there we are. On a magnificent 4-poster bed with dusty hangings lay Crookshanks, purring loudly at the sight of them. On the floor beside him, clutching his leg, which stuck out at a strange angle, was Ron. Harry and Hermione, dashed across to him. Ron, are you okay? Where's the dog? Not a dog, Ron moaned. His teeth were gritted with pain. Harry, it's a trap. What? He's the dog. He's an animagus. Ron was staring over Harry's shoulder. Harry wheeled around with a snap. The man in the shadows closed the door behind them. A mass of filthy matted hair hung to his elbows. If eyes hadn't been shining out of the deep, dark sockets, he might have been a corpse. The waxy skin was stretched so tightly over the bones of his face, it looked like a skull. His yellow teeth were bared in a grin. It was Sirius Black. Expelliarmus, he croaked, pointing Ron's wand at them. Harry's and Hermione's wands shot out of their hands, high in the air, and Black caught them. Then he took a step closer. His eyes were fixed on Harry. I thought you'd come and help your friend, he said hoarsely. His voice sounded as though he had long since lost the habit of using it. Your father would have done the same for me. Brave of you not to run for a teacher. I'm grateful. It will make everything much easier. The reveal of Sirius Black. After hunting Harry for the entire book, now we come face to face in exactly the same way as the specter of the Grim, the specter of the Black Dog was made physical, was made incarnate in the previous scene. Now Sirius Black, who has loomed just as powerfully over the movement of this plot, is here. He is real, he is physical, and that physicality is emphasized beautifully here. The mass of filthy matted hair. If eyes hadn't been shining out of the deep dark sockets, he might have been a corpse. The waxy skin stretched so tight over the bones of his face it looked like a skull. He has been all but dehumanized. Presenting him here as a corpse is not incidental. It is not inadvertent, and it certainly isn't careless. One of the things that we're going to be looking at through the course of these 2 chapters, and again, really onward through the rest of the series, albeit intermittently. This isn't going to be a primary theme of the rest of the Harry Potter series, but it is going to be a significant theme. We are going to be looking at humanity and inhumanity, sometimes figurative inhumanity, sometimes literal inhumanity. And it is no mistake here that we are rendering Sirius Black in inhuman terms before we begin to move toward his humanity, which we'll actually do precious little of this week. Stick around for next week's session of Dear Mr. Potter to get to Sirius Black's humanity. Yes. Your father would have done the same for me, quotes Betsy. Seems so awful with the information we currently have, but it really is heartwarming in retrospect. Yes, yes, good. I think you're completely right. Again, so much that comes back. Aussie's Da, this is your first time joining us, I think, Aussie's Da. Welcome to the live session. And I think Betsy is joining us for the first time too. Good. Glad to have you both with us. Aussie's Da says, I think this dialogue by Sirius is a little clumsy. Why would he want Harry here if he wanted to take Peter and kill him? Does that really make it easier? Well, again, we have to parse the text a little bit, right? I thought you'd come and help your friend, he said hoarsely. His voice sounded as though he had lost the habit of using it. Okay. I thought you would come and help your friend. Period. End of thought. Your father would have done the same for me, period. End of thought. Brave of you not to run for a teacher. I'm grateful. It will make everything much easier. What is he referring to? Well, it seems to me he's referring to brave of you not to run for a teacher. This is going to be easier. The awful thing that I have to do right now is going to be easier because you didn't run for help. That, I think, is the connection that he is making here, rather than, hey, Harry, nice to have you here. But it is ambiguous enough that it works in both senses, right? It works from our linear understanding of Sirius Black, our first time through the book, but it also works as a nicely turned piece of dialogue for the repetition of this scene in subsequent reads. I think that our understanding of Sirius Black, and this is pretty much true, I think, throughout both of these chapters tonight, our understanding of Sirius Black works whether it is our first time through this book or we are returning to this book and Sirius is already a relatively familiar figure to us. Most of it. Oh, it's Erica's first time too. You guys, it is great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Stepping in right for the end here of Dear Mr. Potter. Just a couple more weeks to go. I can't wait to get to it. Okay, let's keep going because, as has been noted, we have a lot of ground to cover. There'll only be one murder here tonight, said Black, and his grin widened. Why's that? Harry spat, trying to wrench himself free of Ron and Hermione. Didn't care last time, did you? Didn't mind slaughtering all those muggles to get at Pettigrew. What's the matter, gone soft in Azkaban? Harry, Hermione whimpered. Be quiet. He killed my mom and dad, Harry roared. And with a huge effort, he broke free of Hermione's and Ron's restraint and lunged forward. He had forgotten about magic. He had forgotten that he was short and skinny and 13, whereas Black was a tall, full-grown man. All Harry knew was that he wanted to hurt Black as badly as he could, and that he didn't care how much he got hurt in return. Perhaps it was the shock of Harry doing something so stupid, but Black didn't raise the wands in time. One of Harry's hands fastened over his wasted wrist, forcing the wand tips away. The knuckles of Harry's other hand collided with the side of Black's head and they fell backward into the wall. Hermione was screaming. Ron was yelling. There was a blinding flash as the wands in Black's hand set a jet of sparks into the air that missed Harry's face by inches. Harry felt the shrunken arm under his fingers twisting madly, but he clung on, his other hand punching every part of Black it could find. But Black's free hand had found Harry's throat. No, he hissed. I've waited too long. The fingers tightened. Harry choked, his glasses askew. Yes, we're quoting some of our favorite lines here. Nikki quotes, he had forgotten that he was short and skinny and 13. Isn't this beautiful? Oh, C-Star is also joining us for the first time on Dear Mr. Potter. C-Star, I recognized you from there and back again, and thus your name did not jump out at me, but I'm very glad to have you here too. This is wonderful. This is one of my favorite moments in the entire book. We've been talking about Harry's desire for vengeance. Harry has talked explicitly about killing Sirius Black, and we've talked about what a transgressive thought that is. Never mind the action that must necessarily accompany it. The thought itself is transgressive. It is a thought that bespeaks a lack of faith in jurisprudence, in the legalistic structures of the wizarding world. There is no justice except that justice which Harry takes into his own hands, as he does here. Why is that? Harry spat, trying to wrench himself free of Ron and Hermione. Didn't care last time, did you? Okay. Didn't care last time, did you? Didn't mind slaughtering all those muggles to get at Pettigrew. What's the matter? Gone soft in Azkaban? So first off, let's talk about the muggles that you killed. But then Harry immediately pivots. When he's challenged by Hermione, Harry, Hermione whimpered, be quiet. He killed my mom and dad, in all caps, Harry roared, and with a huge effort, he broke free of Hermione's and Ron's restraint and lunged forward. He had forgotten about magic. He had forgotten that he was short and skinny and 13. What is Harry here? What is he in this moment? He has forgotten about magic. Pretty definitive to Harry's life and experience. He had forgotten that he was short and skinny and 13. He breaks free, literally breaks free of the restraint of both his pathos and logos, right? Of both his emotional and rational sides. He is now literally unencumbered by rationality and by empathy. What is Harry in this moment? Well, it seems to me that Harry in this moment is what Harry is when he is deprived of the mediating influences of Hermione and Ron. And I don't mean that Harry is this all the time, and if he wasn't friends with Ron and Hermione, this is how he would act. I mean that at his purest, Harry is a hero. A hero, not necessarily in the virtuous sense, not necessarily in the ethical sense, not even necessarily in the civil sense. Harry is, as we've discussed before, particularly in the pages of Chamber of Secrets, Harry is a classical hero. He is simply greater than those around him, and that greatness allows him to act when others won't, when others can't. Harry is an actor. He is an agent. He takes action in a way that other characters can't. And here he is stripped of civility, stripped of community, stripped of society, even in his breaking away from Hermione and from Ron, in his forgetting about his physical body, in his forgetting about magic, he has rendered himself bestial. In the face of opposition, he has become less human, vitally. That, of course, is thematically resonant with much of what we'll get in these chapters. Yeah. Elizabeth says, I love Harry Potter, you beautiful boy, you brave, brave man. Yeah, this is, yes, as Alan says, right? Slytherin Harry, all he knew was that he wanted to hurt Black as badly as he could. Kind of Slytherin Harry. I think that, again, Slytherin and Gryffindor, kind of two sides of the same coin. What differentiates Gryffindor and Slytherin? Well, yes, okay, courage and ambition, firstly. But at a deeper level, it is about the purpose of the result of action, right? Gryffindors generally work for the betterment of everyone. They work, generally speaking, to enforce, or not to enforce, but to foster and encourage and protect and to guard the civil infrastructure, to protect community, right? Why do Gryffindors act? To protect people. Basically, they are the heroes that take action to protect people. Why do Slytherins act? Well, generally for personal advancement. Why is Harry acting here? He wants to hurt Black, but we don't get the why. Let me read that passage again. All Harry knew was that he wanted to hurt Black as badly as he could and that he didn't care how much he got hurt in return. Why does he want to hurt Sirius? Well, vengeance? Possibly. Fury? Possibly. It's difficult to be sure whether this is something that is for Harry or whether he sees this as a kind of justice. Yeah. Good. Brandon says, on one hand, you see Harry's Gryffindor defying Sirius and defending his parents' honor. On the other hand, you see the Slytherin in his anger and desire to harm Sirius. Yeah, I think that's true. Good. And M says, can we please just have an honest conversation followed by a nice long hug? Well, minor spoilers, but we'll get there. Don't worry. All right, let's keep going. Yeah. Oh, I wanted to call out too. Yes, the way that we connect this. Okay, Harry is beating Sirius Black here. Then Sirius responds, "No, he has waited too long." The fingers tightened. Harry choked. His glasses askew. Why do we mention the glasses there? And why askew? His glasses are squint slightly, like his glasses aren't straight on his face. Well, partly because that's a very evocative detail, right? Partly because we get a sense of the physicality of this conflict because Harry is now, he is disheveled, I suppose, to use a very weak word here, but he is taking his hits here from Sirius Black. But more importantly, I think because his glasses are representative of civility, right? His glasses are a consequence of society. He's wearing these in a way because we are referencing them here in a way because they connect him back to the civil infrastructure that he has left behind in his bestial fury. Yeah. Okay, let's keep going. Going to kill me, Harry, he whispered. Harry stopped right above him, his wand still pointing at Black's chest, looking down at him. A livid bruise was rising around Black's left eye and his nose was bleeding. You killed my parents, said Harry, his voice shaking slightly, but his wand hand quite steady. Black stared up at him out of the sunken eyes. I don't deny it, he said very quietly. But if you knew the whole story. The whole story, Harry repeated, a furious pounding in his ears. You sold them to Voldemort. That's all I need to know. You've got to listen to me, Black said, and there was a note of urgency in his voice now. You'll regret it. If you don't understand. I understand a lot better than you think, said Harry, and his voice shook more than ever. You never heard her, did you? My mom trying to stop Voldemort killing me, and you did that. You did it. Before either of them could say another word, something ginger streaked past Harry. Crookshanks leapt onto Black's chest and settled himself there, right over Black's heart. Black blinked and looked down at the cat. Get off, he murmured, trying to push Crookshanks off him. But Crookshanks sank his claws into Black's robes and wouldn't shift. He turned his ugly, squashed face to Harry and looked up at him with those great yellow eyes. To his right, Hermione gave a dry sob. Harry stared down at Black and Crookshanks, his grip tightening on the wand. So what if he had to kill the cat too? It was in league with Black. If it was prepared to die trying to protect Black, that wasn't Harry's business. If Black wanted to save it, that only proved he cared more for Crookshanks than for Harry's parents. Harry raised the wand. Now was the moment to do it. Now was the moment to avenge his mother and father. He was going to kill Black. He had to kill Black. This was his chance. All of our questions about Harry's motivation here, well, I guess they haven't fallen away because we don't necessarily know where he started this emotional arc, but, well, we definitely know where he ended it, don't we? He raised his wand. Now was the moment to do it. Now was the moment to avenge his mother and father. He was going to kill Black. He had to kill Black. This was his chance. So what do we make of Crookshanks? Harry is about to explain to Hermione that they're friends. That is why Crookshanks is protecting Black. Is that it? Is that all that Crookshanks is doing? Does Crookshanks understand how much danger Sirius Black is in right now? Is there something else going on? Well, we can debate about that. We honestly can, because we don't really get a definitive answer on Crookshanks, and perhaps that is one of the squandered plot threads here in Prisoner of Azkaban. We never really get a direct account. We never really get a clean perspective, but God, it works emotionally, doesn't it? Crookshanks coming out, a streak of ginger, he hurries to protect Sirius because he knows what is coming. You did that. You did it. Before either of them could say another word, something ginger streaked past Harry. And then we get this wonderful moment of humanity from Sirius Black. He blinks and looks down at the cat. Get off, he murmurs, trying to push Crookshanks off him. But Crookshanks sank his claws into Black's robes and wouldn't shift. He turned his ugly, squashed face to Harry and looked up at him with those great yellow eyes. To his right, Hermione gave a dry sob. And now Harry has to do more. Now Harry has to cross another threshold. Now he is being challenged again. Yes, Harry, maybe Sirius Black is deserving of your vengeance and your wrath. Is Crookshanks? Is that a line that you're willing to cross? Are you willing to take the life of an innocent in order to achieve vengeance, in order to achieve justice? Let's give Harry the benefit of the doubt here. Let's say that Harry is 100% right. And let's say, furthermore, that Sirius Black deserves to die for what he has done. Is Harry right to cross that line? Is he right to even consider crossing that line? Well, I think we, from our privileged position, would say no. I think we all understand that this is a real test for Harry. But by forcing Harry into this position, we get to see how far he has gone, how inhuman Harry now is. And humanity is a nebulous concept within the pages of Harry Potter, because not everyone that is human has humanity, and not everything that is inhuman lacks humanity. We are going to see some very human figures. We have already seen some very human figures that are not actually literally human. So what is it that we mean by humanity and inhumanity? Well, in a sense, it's simply empathy. I think that empathy is the key that unlocks a great deal of Harry Potter, of understanding the deepest emotional motivations in Harry Potter's story, right from the beginning, of course, but increasingly so as we move into a more adult realm. Empathy kind of eclipses obligation. Why does Harry do what he does? Well, he's obliged to do what he does because he's the hero, because, as we've said before, his name is on the front of the book, because he's the boy who lived, because special circumstances apply to Harry Potter, special rules apply to Harry Potter. But increasingly, we're going to challenge that with a very human empathy, with a very adult empathy. And that's something, too, that we've been exploring in the pages of this book in the periphery, mostly, of course, through Ron, but not just through Ron. And I want to be careful when we talk about the kind of empathetic and rationalistic distinction between Hermione and Ron, not to render Hermione, you know, some automaton. You know, she's not robotic in her connection with people. She's absolutely capable of empathy. It's just the way that she filters and expresses that empathy is very different. We talked about this, of course, with the Buckbeak trial. How does Hermione try and solve it? Through legal precedents. She obeys the rules and fights the fight that she can fight. How does Ron try and solve it? By appealing to empathy, by appealing to emotion and to understanding, by generating and evoking understanding. How does Harry solve it? By breaking the damn rules. That's how Harry solves it. That's how Harry solves most things. Yeah. Okay, Let's keep going here. Ozzy's Da says he is right to consider it because this is what increases the tension. If he wasn't tempted, there'd be no reason to think he'd do it. Fair, right? Narratively speaking, why is he in this position? Because we want to emphasize how far Harry has gone, and we want to generate this kind of this narrative and emotional inertia at this point, or not even generate at this point, but to continue to expand this narrative inertia at this point. That's very, very tough. Yeah. Harry kicks ass, says Goldarts Winters. Hermione finds out how to do so. Ron makes tea. Hey, no bad thing. No bad thing. Thank you, Ron, for making the tea. Someone has to do it. All right, on to our next slide. Black made a startled movement that almost dislodged Crookshanks. Harry gripped his wand convulsively. Do it now, said a voice in his head. But the footsteps were thundering up the stairs, and Harry still hadn't done it. The door of the room burst open in a shower of red sparks, and Harry wheeled around as Professor Lupin came hurtling into the room, his face bloodless, his wand raised and ready. His eyes flickered over Ron lying on the floor, over Hermione cowering next to the door, to Harry standing there with his wand covering Black, and then to Black himself, crumpled and bleeding at Harry's feet. Expelliarmus! Lupin shouted. Harry's wand flew once more out of his hand. So did the two Hermione was holding. Lupin caught them all deftly, then moved into the room, staring at Black, who still had Crookshanks lying protectively across his chest. Harry stood there, feeling suddenly empty. He hadn't done it. His nerve had failed him. Black was going to be handed back to the Dementors. Then Lupin spoke in a very tense voice. Where is he, Sirius? Harry looked quickly at Lupin. He didn't understand what Lupin meant. Who was Lupin talking about? He turned to look at Black again. Black's face was quite expressionless. For a few seconds, he didn't move at all. Then, very slowly, he raised his empty hand and pointed straight at Ron. Mystified, Harry glanced around at Ron, who looked bewildered. So, Lupin comes to the rescue? Question? Maybe not. Not to the rescue, but comes anyway. This is an enormously powerful moment. He disarms everyone in the room. The balance of power has changed. And what is the nature of that balance of power? Well, we have to look very carefully at that first paragraph. Black made a startled movement that almost dislodged Crookshanks. Harry gripped his wand convulsively. Do it now, said a voice in his head. But the footsteps were thundering up the stairs, and Harry still hadn't done it. We've got to look there at, well, a couple of things. We've got to look, of course, at the shift in POV. We've got to look at the shift in perspective there. Harry gripped his wand convulsively, but the footsteps were thundering up the stairs, and Harry still hadn't done it. We are, within the frame of a single sentence there, forcibly removed from Harry's POV. Harry gripped his wand convulsively. We're right there, as we were in the previous slide, as we were in the preceding passage. We're right there in Harry's experience. The world is chaotic. The world is a whirlwind, and we are right in the heart of Harry's experience, but then we're pulled back. But the footsteps were thundering up the stairs, and Harry still hadn't done it. Then we cut out to the door of the room bursting open. So that's interesting. First off, we have this kind of cinematically, we have this pullback from a very close shot on Harry back to the room. We get to see this action sequence from an external POV, which is enormously powerful. What is more important here? Do it now, said a voice in his head. Those of you who have read the series will, of course, provide the answer to this question immediately in the Crowdcast chat. I urge you not to do that, perhaps, but we must question at this point, whose voice? Whose voice is this speaking in his head? Is this himself? Well, possibly. We have had Harry kind of incarnate, kind of personify his inner monologue in the past. We've seen few examples of that happening, but examples nonetheless. Is that what this feels like? Or does this feel like an external pressure? And of course, now that we're talking about Harry Potter in the context of The Lord of the Rings, now that I've already kind of cracked the seal and talking about There and Back Again, now that we were discussing last week, Harry's response to his firebolt being not unlike the response of various characters in The Lord of the Rings to the One Ring and in The Hobbit too, I guess. I'm forced to question here, is this an external voice influencing Harry? And if so, who is it? Exactly. Yes, a few people calling it out in the Crowdcast. The voice is Darth Sidious, says Art K there. Yes. Good. What are the red sparks, says Katie Schnell. I can only assume that is whatever spell Lupin uses to break the charm or the enchantment that Sirius Black put on the door. I think we get a nice beat there. Okay, two ways of interpreting this. Firstly, that Sirius, while closing the door, or perhaps even prior to closing the door, cast a spell on the door, that this is some kind of very simple locking spell. And the red spark is, what the result of Remus Lupin breaking that spell in order to open it. The second and possibly more interesting argument here is that it is a spell cast by Remus Lupin that breaks not a spell put in place by Sirius Black, but a part of the enchantment that lies upon the Shrieking Shack itself. Perhaps there are elements of the Shrieking Shack that are not apparent to the naked eye, such as closed doors. We'll get to that in just a moment. Yes. Good. As we explain what it is that's happening here. The voice in Harry's head starts to feel like his Godric Hollow flashback, says Drew. Very good pull. Yes. And C-Star asks, really, what is the it that Harry was about to do? Do it now. Kill Sirius Black? How? What is it that Harry is going to do exactly? What is it that he is going to, to kind of distill this down as simply as we can, what spell is he going to cast? What is he going to do? And why is that more just than the alternative? Because, for all of our talk of crime and punishment, we get a really important beat here. Let's see if I can find it here on the page. Where is it? Oh, yes. Harry stood there feeling suddenly empty. He hadn't done it. His nerve had failed him. Black was going to be handed back to the Dementors. Harry has lost. He hasn't achieved his goal. He hasn't done what he wanted to do. He hasn't won this encounter. Semicolon, Sirius Black is going to be handed back to the Dementors. Is that not justice? Is that not justice of a sort? Well, no. Because Harry, by this point, has completely rejected the legalistic structure of the wizarding world. There is no justice to be found in Azkaban for Sirius Black. It doesn't matter that that is the appropriate punishment that has been levied against Sirius Black by his society. Doesn't matter. That is not justice. Harry taking direct action is justice. This is very much an eye for an eye. Yeah, we're getting some thoughts here on the killing curse, on one of the unforgivable curses, but we don't know about those yet, and Harry certainly doesn't know about those yet. So, could he instinctively do it? Possibly, yes. Yes, as Jamie says, is he capable of casting AK in his passion? Later in the series, Bellatrix says to cast an unforgivable, you have to really mean it. Is that more important than knowing the words? Yes, exactly, right? As Art says, could Harry still have killed without the killing curse? Nikki says, expanding on this point, how would a person be able to use the Avada Kedavra curse in actuality, though? With other spells, there's a method you have to learn. You can't just say the words. So how could you perform the spell if you've never practiced it, or at least seen the wand movements? All of this is true. Is this a moment of raw power? Is this undisciplined magic? Is this wild magic? We've seen it before, right? We've had these moments of wild magic. What happens when Harry grabs Sirius's hands and pushes them apart? What are the sparks that rake the wall from Sirius's wand, from Ron's wand, I guess, presumably? What is that? Sirius doesn't cast a spell. Certainly, we don't get, attributed dialogue to Sirius Black in that moment. So is that a different kind of charm? Is that wild magic? We know now that wild magic exists. We know from gosh, our introduction to this entire book with the whole inflation episode. We know that wild magic exists. Is that a consequence of this? Is Harry simply going to channel raw magic now? Maybe. I wonder if he's going to kill Sirius Black with magic at all. Yeah. Imagine if he'd accidentally blown him up like Aunt Marge. Haha, says M. Yes, that would have been a weird beat there. That would have been a weird beat. Yes, and Corporeal says, is using a killing curse worse than just levitating a knife into their chest or whatever? We'll talk about the killing curse when we get there. We'll talk about the unforgivable curses and why they are unforgivable when we get to them. Yes. Okay, let's keep moving on. Lupin was lowering his wand, gazing fixedly at Black. The professor walked to Black's side, seized his hand, pulled him to his feet so the Crookshanks fell to the floor, and embraced Black like a brother. Harry felt as though the bottom had dropped out of his stomach. "I don't believe it!" Hermione screamed. Lupin let go of Black and turned to her. She'd raised herself off the floor and was pointing at Lupin, wild-eyed. You, Hermione, you and him? Hermione, calm down. I didn't tell anyone, Hermione shrieked. I've been covering up for you. Hermione, listen to me, please, Lupin shouted. I can explain. Harry could feel himself shaking, not with fear, but with a fresh wave of fury. I trusted you, he shouted at Lupin, his voice wavering out of control. And all the time you've been his friend. You're wrong, said Lupin. I haven't been Sirius's friend, but I am now. Let me explain. No, Hermione screamed. Harry, don't trust him. He's been helping Black get into the castle. He wants you dead too. He's a werewolf. There was a ringing silence. Everyone's eyes were now on Lupin, who looked remarkably calm, though rather pale. Not at all up to your usual standard, Hermione, he said. Only 1 out of 3, I'm afraid. I have not been helping Sirius get into the castle, and I certainly don't want Harry dead. An odd shiver passed over his face. But I won't deny that I am a werewolf. I talked extensively earlier about exposition and about how demanding exposition can be, about how difficult it is to have a number of characters sitting around, particularly when they're expositing for the benefit of the reader, how difficult it is to have characters sit around and say, well, as you know, I am a werewolf, and that means that I am bound by certain rules and restrictions. J.K. Rowling manages to sidestep that beautifully. And again, I mentioned earlier how she drives this entire passage forward, this entire reading forward through her profound mastery of these characters. And this is a perfect example. This is arguably the most perfect example in this entire book. Of course, Hermione has figured out that Remus Lupin is a werewolf. Of course she has. It is wildly implausible that she wouldn't. But we don't tip our hand to that secret earlier in the book. We hold it back so that now, instead of Lupin being, Harry, I have to tell you, I'm a werewolf, we get this moment of actual dynamism, of present conflict that is profound and beautiful. This entire interaction, God, it works so well for me. It's another moment of Hermione's greatest hits here. Just good, yes. Yes, as Ryan says, Ron's "get away from me, werewolf" is one of those powerful lines. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yeah, and Brandon says, I really like the movie's line here as Lupin says, my, you really are the brightest witch of your age. Yes, it's very good. Question for you here, though, in the book. I didn't tell anyone. I've been covering up for you. Hermione, listen to me. Please, Lupin shouted. I can explain. I trusted you, and all the time you've been his friend, says Harry. You're wrong. I haven't been Sirius's friend, but I am now. Let me explain. And then Hermione tells the truth. Does Lupin know that Hermione knows? Have they had a conversation about it? I've been covering up for you. That implies a certain complicity, doesn't it? That implies a certain reciprocal awareness, if not a reciprocal relationship. That suggests to me that Lupin is more than aware that Hermione, has figured out his true identity, figured out the puzzle of his nature, and is keeping it to herself. Yeah. Yes, Nikki says only 1. I'm afraid it must have been so difficult to say he was a werewolf out loud. I love that beat. This is terrific. Not at all up to your usual standard, Hermione. Only 1 out of 3. The fact that he grades her on this in this moment, this is not, I think, just a moment of positive condescension to Hermione, right? This isn't just Lupin kind of, yes, he's descending to the level of a student and kind of communicating with her in a way that he knows that she will appreciate. That is certainly one way to read it. And I think that that's not a negative way of reading it at all. The fact that he is displaying a certain empathy for Hermione here, the fact that he is code switching into the kind of vernacular that will give Hermione some kind of comfort, I think actually speaks very well of Remus Lupin. Not at all up to your usual standards, Hermione. Only 1 out of 3, I'm afraid. And then he corrects her. I have not been helping Sirius get into the castle. I certainly don't want Harry dead, but I won't deny that I'm a werewolf. 1 out of 3. Let's call that a C. Let's call that a C on your grade here, Hermione. So he code switches down to her. That's one way of interpreting that. But there was another, arguably more powerful and arguably more tragic reason for this code switching. Why does he start talking as though he's a professor? Because he's a professor. Because that part of his life has for the last year been arguably the most important part of his life. He has been salvaged. He has been reclaimed from the wilderness, from the personal and emotional tyrannies of his condition, of his lycanthropy. Thanks to the Wolfsbane potion that Snape brews for him, he's had a life for the last year, for the first time since he left Hogwarts, arguably. And I think that by moving back into his professorial persona in that moment, I see a Professor Lupin, a Remus Lupin. Okay, let me phrase that more carefully. I see a Remus Lupin who is wrapping himself in the garb of Professor Lupin. He's wrapping himself in civility and in belonging, and he's remembering what that is like. He's not the beast now. He's not even the man who is sometimes the beast. He's the professor. That, to me, gosh, just feels so powerful. That really speaks to me. Yeah. So now we've had it. Let's move into some of our explanation. The map, said Lupin. The Marauders map. I was in my office examining it. Do you know how to work it? Harry said suspiciously. Of course I know how to work it, said Lupin, waving his hand impatiently. I helped write it. I'm Moony. That was my friend's nickname for me at school. You wrote? The important thing is, I was watching it carefully this evening because I had an idea that you, Ron, and Hermione might try and sneak out of the castle to visit Hagrid before his hippogriff was executed. And I was right, wasn't I? He had started to pace up and down, looking at them. Little patches of dust rose at his feet. You might have been wearing your father's old cloak, Harry. How do you know about the cloak? The number of times I saw James disappearing under it, said Lupin, waving an impatient hand again. The point is, even if you're wearing an invisibility cloak, you still show up on the Marauders map. I watched you cross the grounds and enter Hagrid's hut. 20 minutes later, you left Hagrid and set off back toward the castle, but you are now accompanied by somebody else. What? Said Harry. No, we weren't. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Moony, the first of the Marauders to whom we shall be introduced. The mechanics of the Marauders map are excellent, I think, excellently used in this book. I do know from having read some discussion on the subject that J.K. Rowling kind of regrets implementing the Marauders map and giving it so much power because it does make some circumstances later in the series very difficult. And yes, there is absolutely a time turner conversation to be had, but for now, and we'll talk much more about this when we get to it, but for now, let's say that time is not completely constant in the world of Harry Potter, and no one has done that yet. No one is where they ought not to be yet. That, I think, will do it for that discussion. We'll, as I say, circle back around to that. We'll time turn back around to that in due course. So he knows that they're going to slip out. He knows about the invisibility cloak. He knows everything. He's had this connection with James. He's responsible for the Marauders map, at least partly for the Marauders map, and he knows how it works, which does, of course, explain how he responds to the Marauders map when he gets his hands on it earlier. Yeah. Okay, good. Sirius, no! Lupin yelled, launching himself forward and dragging Black away from Ron again. Wait! You can't do it just like that. They need to understand. We've got to explain. We could explain afterwards, snarled Black, trying to throw Lupin off. One hand was still clawing the air as if to reach Scabbers, who was squealing like a piglet, scratching Ron's face and neck as he tried to escape. They've got a right to know everything, Lupin panted, still trying to restrain Black. Ron's kept him as a pet. There are parts of it I don't even understand. And Harry, you owe Harry the truth, Sirius. Black stopped, struggling, though his hollowed eyes were still fixed on Scabbers, who was clamped tightly under Ron's bitten, scratched, and bleeding hands. All right, then, Black said, without taking his eyes off the rat. Tell them whatever you like, but make it quick, Remus. I want to commit the murder I was imprisoned for. You're nutters, both of you, said Ron shakily, looking round at Harry and Hermione for support. I've had enough of this. I'm off. He tried to heave himself up on his good leg, but Lupin raised his wand again, pointing it at Scabbers. You're going to hear me out, Ron, he said quietly. Just keep a tight hold on Peter while you listen. So we've had the reveal, dun dun dun, that Scabbers is Peter Pettigrew, but we don't yet know the mechanism. So now we have this standoff. Lupin is directly threatening Ron. You're going to hear me out, Ron, he said quietly. Just keep a tight hold on Peter while you listen. Let's all be civil. Let's all be cool just for like 5 minutes, and all of this can be explained. You have a right to know what is happening. Harry, in particular, has a right to know what is happening, and Sirius relents. Why is Sirius here? What is it that he is trying to accomplish? Well, we get the line. Tell them whatever you like, but make it quick, Remus. I want to commit the murder I was imprisoned for. The idea of crime and punishment is, as I said before, encoded throughout the pages of this book. We address it from a number of different perspectives. We circle back around to it from a number of POVs. We interrogate it from a number of different positions, from a number of different vantage points. This one, though, is almost unique. This one is unlike any of the others that we'll see in the pages of this book. Because the thing about crime and punishment is that one is usually the cause and one is usually the effect. Right? One comes first. The crime happens and then the punishment. But that is not the experience of Sirius Black, as we'll discover in next week's reading, I guess. Sirius Black has been punished for a crime that he didn't commit. Now, does he want to clear his name? Does he want to separate himself from this infamy, from this notoriety? No. He's served his time. Now he wants to justify it. He has paid his debt in advance for the crime that he is absolutely willing and eager to commit. What perspective does that give us on crime and punishment? Because for all that we've been pushing back against the notion of Azkaban as a responsible, institution within the wizarding world, as an appropriate, mode of incarceration, not even like the physical building of Azkaban, but the spirit of Azkaban, if you like, the severity and the depravity of Azkaban. We've questioned whether or not that is appropriate throughout the pages of this book. One person who doesn't question that, Sirius Black. It's fine. I've paid my time. I've paid my dues. I've done my time. I'm ready now to kind of come full circle, to do the thing that I was imprisoned for, thereby, in a sense, validating my imprisonment. There's no sense here of, again, justice, right? Harry sets aside wizard world justice because he wants to kill Sirius Black, because he believes in vengeance, because he believes in justice. A personal kind of immediate justice. The death of Sirius Black is all that will fulfill that for Harry. Sirius doesn't, though. He is not murderous in that same way. He's not rejecting the legalistic framework of the wizarding world. He is, quite to the contrary, seeking to perfect, seeking to embody, seeking to justify that entire kind of legalistic structure, right? The entire kind of notion of crime and punishment in the wizarding world. No, Sirius Black's completely on board. He just flipped it. He just, interestingly, inverted it in time. Gives us a perspective there on what Sirius Black is going through. Yeah, Sirius is also worried about Harry's safety, says Kate. He never had the will to escape until he knew that Peter was a direct threat to Harry. Absolutely, yes. Gildarts Winter says, Harry wants to kill a dog, the dog wants to kill a rat, the cat wants to kill the rat. No animals were harmed at the writing of this novel. Oh, no animals. Ron certainly was. Yeah, you know what I mean. Okay. Let's keep pushing on. Harry looked down at Ron, and as their eyes met, they agreed silently. Black and Lupin were both out of their minds. Their story made no sense whatsoever. How could Scabbers be Peter Pettigrew? Azkaban must have unhinged Black after all, but why was Lupin playing along with him? Then Hermione spoke in a trembling, would-be calm sort of voice, as though trying to will Professor Lupin to talk sensibly. But, Professor Lupin, Scabbers can't be Pettigrew, and it just can't be true. You know it can't. Why can't it be true? Lupin said calmly, as though they were in class and Hermione had simply spotted a problem in an experiment with Grindylows. Because people would know if Peter Pettigrew had been an animagus. We did animagi in class with Professor McGonagall, and I looked them up when I did my homework. The Ministry of Magic keeps tabs on witches and wizards who can become animals. There's a register showing what animal they become, and their markings and things. And I went and looked Professor McGonagall up in the register, and there have only been 7 animagi this century, and Pettigrew's name wasn't on the list. Harry had barely enough time to marvel inwardly at the effort Hermione put into her homework when Lupin started to laugh. Right again, Hermione, he said. But the Ministry never knew that there used to be 3 unregistered animagi running around Hogwarts. If you're going to tell him the story, get a move on, Remus, snarled Black, who was still watching Scabbers' every desperate move. I've waited 12 years. I'm not going to wait much longer. How can he be an animagus? Well, because there are unregistered animagi. Just a little bit of sealant there around the edges of this plot. Can everyone do this? Well, no, not everyone can. In fact, it is very rare. That's why people don't assume it all the time. That's why no one necessarily drew the connection between the big black dog and Sirius Black. No one knew that that was the case. No one knew that he could shapeshift in exactly that form. There have only been 7 animagi this century. One of whom, of course, Professor McGonagall, because we met her in her cat form right back on the first page of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Yes, good. Someone broke the rules? Yes, fair. He should have given 10 points to Gryffindor for that. I don't know, are you allowed to give points to Hogwarts students when you're not on Hogwarts grounds? It's an interesting question, yes. And Katie asks a fascinating question. How many other unregistered animagi do you think there are? Good question. So now we get the backstory on Professor Lupin's lycanthropy. I was a very small boy when I received the bite. My parents tried everything, but in those days there was no cure. The potion that Professor Snape had been making for me is a very recent discovery. It makes me safe, you see. As long as I take it in the week preceding the full moon, I keep my mind when I transform. I am able to curl up in my office, a harmless wolf, and wait for the moon to wane again. Before the wolfsbane potion was discovered, however, I became a full-fledged monster once a month. It seemed impossible that I would be able to come to Hogwarts. Other parents weren't likely to want their children exposed to me. But then Dumbledore became headmaster, and he was sympathetic. He said that as long as we took certain precautions, there was no reason I shouldn't come to school. Lupin sighed and looked directly at Harry. I told you, months ago, that the Whomping Willow was planted the year I came to Hogwarts. The truth is, it was planted because I came to Hogwarts. This house, Lupin looked miserably around the room, the tunnel that leads to it, they were built for my use. Once a month, I was smuggled out of the castle into this place to transform. The tree was placed at the tunnel mouth to stop anyone coming across me while I was dangerous. Harry couldn't see where the story was going, but he was listening raptly all the same. The only sound apart from Lupin's voice was Scabbard's frightened squeaking. My transformations in those days were terrible. It is very painful to turn into a werewolf. I was separated from humans to bite, so I bit and scratched myself instead. The villagers heard the noise and the screaming and thought they were hearing particularly violent spirits. Dumbledore encouraged the rumor. Even now, when the house has been silent for years, the villagers don't dare approach it. But apart from my transformations, I was happier than I had ever been in my life. For the first time ever, I had friends. 3 great friends. Sirius Black, Peter Pettigrew, and of course your father, Harry, James Potter. So the Shrieking Shack is created for the specific use of one Remus Lupin, which always strikes me as odd, because that was not so very long ago. It was not so very long ago that Remus Lupin first came to Hogwarts. 20 years ago, thereabouts. The Shrieking Shack has only stood for 20 years, and yet is in that time, or has in that time, become a subject of local legend, that now even the folks in Hogsmeade, most of whom might remember the Shrieking Shack being built in the first place, are convinced that, oh, no, that's just the old haunted shack on the edge of town. Dumbledore does encourage the rumors, but we must wonder if anyone's memory was played with for the construction of the Shrieking Shack. The tunnel, the Whomping Willow, all of these things designed to give Lupin a safe space, to allow him to go to Hogwarts. This is a positive thing, right? This is a kindness from Dumbledore. Then Dumbledore became headmaster. He was sympathetic. He's doing this out of kindness. He said that as long as we took certain precautions, there's no reason I shouldn't come to school. What are the certain precautions? The certain precautions are that we should incarcerate Remus Lupin for a number of days every month so that he can't hurt his community. We can proactively incarcerate him, not for crimes that he has committed, but for crimes which he might commit. Crimes, absolutely, which he doesn't want to commit, but will commit nonetheless. And what happens to Remus Lupin when he is incarcerated? What happens to Remus Lupin when he is removed from his community, removed from his context, and sequestered away within the Shrieking Shack? He becomes inhuman. He becomes inhuman to the point where he says, I was separated from humans to bite. He's not thinking of himself as a human at that point, as of course he arguably shouldn't. He isn't in any way human at that point. But drawing the connection between a violent inhumanity and incarceration in this book doesn't read to me as accidental. It reads to me as another perspective on these topics that we've been discussing throughout, these major themes that have been playing. Is Sirius Black dehumanized? Is he inhumanized by his time in Azkaban? Yeah, pretty powerfully. Is Hagrid dehumanized by his time in Azkaban? Well, less so, but to the extent that Hagrid wishes for the ultimate act of inhumanity, that is death, or I guess the ultimate act of dehumanity, the act of death itself, the experience of death itself, yeah, Hagrid was certainly brought closer to that threshold than anyone could have expected at the time. Harry? Is Harry dehumanized, inhumanized by his experience with the Dursleys? Oh, that kind of depends on where we draw the line of humanity, doesn't it? From a wizarding perspective, are muggles human? Or let me rephrase this. If you are possessed of a particular skill, a particular virtue which is innate to you, and under certain circumstances you are repressed, you are imprisoned in part, you are prevented from fully articulating your own nature, from fully expressing your own nature, isn't that, in a sense, an assault on your humanity? Isn't that, in a sense, an assault on your personhood? Perhaps he is not dehumanized by his time with the Dursleys, but there is an argument that says that he is de-harried. He is less Harry Potter when he is with the Dursleys than he is when he is at Hogwarts with his friends. Are we seeing here different perspectives on the same phenomenon? Are we seeing here different judgments, or are we seeing different consequences entirely? What is the nature of Sirius Black being imprisoned for a crime that he did not commit? Remus Lupin being imprisoned for a circumstance which he cannot avoid. Harry being imprisoned for a circumstance which happened before he had conscious memory or thought. All three of these men are victims, in a sense, and all three of these men are sequestered away from their communities because we must protect society. Because sometimes innocent people do suffer. Because sometimes the system, society itself, must be tyrannical in order to protect the multitude. There is a certain cold and stern mathematics here. But is that even the case? Well, we'll talk more about Sirius Black next week when we get to the final accounting of his story. Yeah. Harry lived in a closet under the stairs. Yes, says Melissa. Yes. Gildarts Winter says, you are robbed of your sense of self. Absolutely, right? Good, good. Yes, Legend said, I forgot the part where it said the shack was built when he came to school. My headcanon was that Hogwarts bought an old abandoned shack and built a tunnel there. Yes, yes. Joseph says that the next time I say lycanthropy, everyone finish their drink. Have I been saying lycanthropy a lot? I do apologize. Yes. That one doesn't jump out at me as something that I say a lot, even in the context of this discussion. But hey, there we are. Good, good. Let me see a comment from, yes, Lupin is dehumanized repeatedly throughout the series. Yes, dehumanized and inconsistently rehumanized. And again, Sirius Black too, right? We're going to have an opportunity to talk about Black and Lupin through the rest of the series because we get very interesting and oftentimes, I think, paired perspectives on humanity there. Yeah, we'll talk about that. Good. Okay, excellent. No, I just said it once, but still. Says Joseph, but still, you know, get through it. Get through all your drinks, guys. Lycanthropy, lycanthropy, lycanthropy. Okay. Oh, one quick thing before we move on. I mentioned earlier that one of the things that J.K. Rowling has done in these passages, I know I'm running a little late, but we will wrap these up. One of the things that J.K. Rowling has done in this reading in particular is connect back to some of the oldest elements within her own mythology, right? Yes, okay. The Shrieking Shack is introduced in this book. Werewolves are introduced in this book. Well, no, technically not. Werewolves introduced in Chamber of Secrets. Those of you who have read that book recently might remember some of the fine works composed by Gilderoy Lockhart. Also, the Whomping Willow introduced back in Chamber of Secrets. But there's one element here that goes back still further, and I refer you to Harry's very first potions class back in the pages of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. What is the difference, Potter, between monk's hood and wolf's bane? At this, Hermione stood up, her hand stretching toward the dungeon ceiling. I don't know, said Harry quietly. I think Hermione does, though. Why don't you try her? A few people laughed. Harry caught Seamus's eye and Seamus winked. Snape, however, was not pleased. Sit down, he snapped at Hermione. For your information, Potter, asphodel and wormwood make a sleeping potion so powerful it is known as the draught of living death. A bezoar is a stone taken from the stomach of a goat and it will save you from most poisons. As for monk's hood and wolf's bane, they are the same plant, which also goes by the name of aconite. Well, why aren't you all copying that down? Back in Chapter 8 of Philosopher's Stone, Snape is doing experiments with wolfsbane. Or at least, wolfsbane is on his mind. Isn't that interesting? I take it to be a kind of nod toward continuing canon that that Dumbledore's pet project for all of these years has been engineering a solution for Remus Lupin, that Remus Lupin has never left Dumbledore's thoughts, and that part of the condition of Snape's employment at Hogwarts is that he continue to advance his science. He continue to advance science, that he continues to advance his art, whatever it is that potion crafting really is, that Snape continue to try his hand at this stuff. And of course, there it is being introduced to Harry all the way back in the first book. All right. Let's keep up. I think we only have maybe 2 more slides to go before Snape reappears in our narrative in the present. Yes, indeed, said Lupin. It took them the best part of 3 years to work out how to do it. Your father and Sirius here were the cleverest students in the school, and lucky they were, because the Animagus transformation can go horribly wrong. One reason the Ministry keeps a close watch on those attempting to do it. Peter needed all the help he could get from James and Sirius. Finally, in our 5th year, they managed it. They could each turn into a different animal at will. But how did that help you? Said Hermione, sounding puzzled. They couldn't keep me company as humans, so they kept me company as animals, said Lupin. A werewolf is only a danger to people. They sneaked out of the castle every month under James's invisibility cloak. They transformed. Peter, as the smallest, could slip beneath the willow's attacking branches and touch the knot that freezes it. They would then slip down the tunnel and join me. Under their influence, I became less dangerous. My body was still wolfish, but my mind seemed to become less so while I was with them. Hurry up, Remus, snarled Black, who was still watching Scabbers with a horrible sort of hunger on his face. I'm getting there, Sirius, I'm getting there. Well, highly exciting possibilities were open to us now that we could all transform. Soon we were leaving the Shrieking Shack and roaming the school grounds and village by night. Sirius and James transformed into such large animals they were able to keep a werewolf in check. I doubt whether any Hogwarts students ever found out more about the Hogwarts grounds and Hogsmeade than we did. And that's how we came to write the Marauders map and sign it with our nicknames. Sirius is Padfoot. Peter is Wormtail. James was Prongs. What sort of animal? Harry began, but Hermione cut him off. Thanks, Hermione. Thanks, Hermione, for preserving a reveal that will come right at the end of the book. I mean, good job. This is our accounting, yes, absolutely, of the creation of the Marauders map, and a little bit more about the Marauders and the fact that they have formed this community which exists outside and almost in direct conflict with their more general community, their more general context. They are not quite a part of Hogwarts at this point, not quite a part of Hogsmeade at this point. They are themselves. They are the Marauders. What do people do when they find themselves outside of other communities? They band the hell together and they start a new community and they give it a name and they give each other new names, and it's all representative of that tribal identity, right? You could, I'm sure, delve deep into the psychology behind the Marauders and write an absolutely fascinating paper about tribalism and identity, particularly in the context of schools, right? Particularly in the context of high schools and kind of fragmented hierarchical cultures which are hived off or separated from their parent culture, whether that is, a high school environment or a particular work environment or prison or colonist environments. I think there's some interesting work that could be done there. I myself am not going to do that work, but hey, if any of you are looking for a thesis statement, go nuts. What's more interesting here for me, though, is what happens to Remus Lupin when all of his friends can take animal form, when his three closest friends in the world become animagi, not like him. Okay, let me take that sentence again and be a little more careful about it. Remus Lupin is not an animagus. He simply has lycanthropy. He is a werewolf. He cannot, by all accounts, cast this charm. That is not what is happening to him. There are 3 unregistered animagi in Hogwarts at that time, not 4. But the 3 who can transform learn to transform in order to keep him company. And what happens to Remus Lupin? Well, he becomes less animalistic. He becomes less the wolf and more the man. Now, yes, he's still dangerous. The fact that Sirius and James can keep him in check, the fact that he notes that they can keep him in check, though he doesn't tell us that they actually kept him in check. It's just that the potential is there, right? He felt safe leaving the Shrieking Shack because, well, it might be all right. It might be all right when they're there. But together they form this more insular community, and community does what community always does, what community at its best does, which is empower the individual, civilize the individual. This is an enormously powerful perspective on crime and punishment, on specifically incarceration, even voluntary incarceration, even arguably necessary and benevolent incarceration. When Lupin is separated from his community, even for his own good and for the good of that community, even though everyone is in agreement, yes, you should go be by yourself right now, it is really bad. He is literally dehumanized by that experience. What happens when he is reintroduced to community, albeit a smaller but much more tightly knit community? He is rehumanized. He is more himself than he was before. He finds a civility. He finds a society and is made civil by that. This is a pretty powerful counter argument against the necessity of preemptive incarceration, but incarceration in general, I think. When we seek to protect society by dehumanizing those elements which oppose it or which challenge it or which are difficult for it, we render those elements less. We make those elements more dangerous. We make them less connected, less invested, less enfranchised in the workings of society. It is in its way, J.K. Rowling seems to be suggesting in the pages of this book, an excessive and permanent solution. We send people to Azkaban, and then all that they can be are prisoners of Azkaban, as Sirius Black is. This scene, says Brandon, says a great deal about how essential community is to our basic human needs. God creates us with that innate sense. Yeah, yes, I'm inclined to agree. I think, well, arguably whether you take a theistic approach to this or an atheistic approach to this or an agnostic approach to this, I think it is demonstrably the case that human beings band together, right? We are all banded together here. We are all banded together here this evening, united by a common cause. And what happens? Well, we seek tribal identifiers. We seek tribal markers. We engage with this community, which is a fragmentary community. You know, this is not anyone's primary community. You know, you all have families and friends and work relationships and real lives and all of that great stuff, as you should. But even in this fragmentary way we connect with this community, that happens 1,000 times a day in 1,000 different ways. And we code switch between those communities. We code switch between those contexts in a way that is uniquely human, powerfully human, vitally human. But still that connection civilizes us. We look for society. We band together. And it's what human beings do. Yeah. Corporeal says Little Red Riding Hood is about a girl losing her virginity. Sometimes, yes. But most often, yes. It is also about just the bestiality of sex, the bestiality of men. It can also have other alternate meanings. One of the great things about Little Red Riding Hood is that it has been retold so many countless hundreds of times that there are versions of Little Red Riding Hood that will speak to pretty much any kind of perspective that you want to take on sex and empowerment and issues of consent. But yes, broadly speaking, it is a men are bestial and bad and should be avoided at all costs, which, you know, maybe not terrible advice for a young woman who's walking in the woods. Yeah. Good. I will someday do a real fairy tale seminar series. I would love to do that. I'm fascinated by the way in which fairy tales evolve and change over time. And yes, many of them are primarily about sex and purity and very outmoded ideals of gosh, femininity and virtue and purity and things of that sort, which sit uncomfortably to a modern reader, but many of them are not. Many of them are actually much more subversive and progressive than you might think. Little Red Riding Hood certainly has versions of that. The Princess and the Frog, there are versions of that which are progressive and subversive in really interesting ways. Even like The Princess and the Pea has some really interesting alternate versions that have been written through the ages. And when I say through the ages, I don't necessarily mean recently. I mean, you can go back into, okay. Let's save all of this for a future fairy tale seminar. We'll get to that at some point, possibly when we're done with the MP. Yeah, good. Okay. Let's keep going. Excellent. I'm all caught up. Sleeping Beauty has a pretty awful story as well, says Nikki. Yeah, most stories pretty bad. Yeah. Okay. So what sort of animal? Well, we'll probably never find out what sort of animal James Potter turned into, or perhaps we will. This is our last slide of the evening. Snape, said Black harshly, taking his eyes off Severus for the first time in minutes and looking up at Lupin. What's Snape got to do with it? He's here, Sirius, said Lupin heavily. He's teaching here as well. He looked up at Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Professor Snape was at school with us. He fought very hard against my appointment to the Defense Against the Dark Arts job. He's been telling Dumbledore all year that I am not to be trusted. He has his reasons. You see, Sirius here played a trick on him which nearly killed him, a trick which involved me. Black made a derisive noise. It served him right, he sneered. Sneaking around, trying to find out what we're up to, hoping he could get us expelled. Severus was very interested in where I went every month, Lupin told Harry, Ron, and Hermione. We were in the same year, you know, and we didn't like each other very much. He especially disliked James. Jealous, I think, of James's talent on the Quidditch field. Anyway, Snape had seen me crossing the grounds with Madame Pomfrey one evening as she led me toward the Whomping Willow to transform. Sirius thought it would be amusing to tell Snape all he had to do was prod the knot on the tree trunk with a long stick and he'd be able to get in after me. And of course, Snape tried it. If he got as far as the house, he would have met a fully grown werewolf. But your father, who'd heard what Sirius had done, went after Snape and pulled him back at great risk to his life. Snape glimpsed me, though, at the end of the tunnel. He was forbidden by Dumbledore to tell anybody, but from that time on, he knew what I was. So that's why Snape doesn't like you, said Harry slowly, because he thought you were in on the joke? That's right, sneered a cold voice from the wall behind Lupin. Severus Snape was pulling off the invisibility cloak, his wand pointing directly at Lupin. So here we are, right at the end of the chapter, ready for our final set of reveals, which we will get next week. And we get a sense of the backstory here of Severus Snape. Why is Severus Snape both open and outright in his hostility to Harry Potter, and yet, as we know from the end of the first book, dedicated to the preservation of Harry's life? Wow, because James Potter did something he couldn't forgive. He saved his life. Sirius Black, on the other hand, tried to kill him. It's tough to read the action of Sirius Black as anything other than an outright assault, right? What did Sirius think was going to happen to Severus Snape at this point? I mean, this seems as though it crosses the line a little bit. We've talked a few times in the course of this novel about Fred and George Weasley, about how close to the line they get and how inappropriate and insupportable their actions are. But this is of a very different sort. This is of an entirely different order, unfortunately. So we'll talk a little more about this when we kind of look back on Sirius's experience at school at the time. Saved his life and stole his girl, says Jackie, putting very important quotes around his. Yeah, we'll get to all of that. Yes. Sirius was a bad kid, like irredeemable, says Kate. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, we'll talk about redemption. That's very true. Good. Nikki says, Snape, why do I feel like slapping Snape with a wet towel so often? That just seems appropriate, doesn't it? Yeah. Harry Potter and the Slow Untangling of Severus Snape's Backstory, says Joseph. Pretty much an alternate title for the whole saga, as it turns out. Let's wrap it up there. I think we've done sterling work this evening, covering so much ground and running just a little long. Next session, chapters 19 and 20, The Servant of Lord Voldemort and the Dementor's Kiss. I have noted here on the slide, 10 p.m. Eastern, Tuesday, October 24th. It may be 10 p.m. Eastern. I may move this one into the afternoon. It may be 4 p.m. Eastern. So stay tuned. Head on over to pointnorthmedia.com. Subscribe to the newsletter. I will have a definite time for the next session in the very near future. And also stay tuned, because we have 2 more sessions of the book and then 1 session discussing the movie. Sometime between now and our discussion of the movie, we will do a live tweet or a conversation in the Point North Discord or something while we all watch the movie together, because God, I love this movie, you guys. And there's a lot to discuss, particularly in its adaptive choices. And of course, gosh, we get to talk about the strength of the performances, if nothing else. This is a brilliantly performed movie, and I'm eagerly looking forward to all of that. We still have some ground to cover in the books, though. 2 more weeks. I can't wait to discuss all of that with you. Thank you all so much for hanging out tonight. Thank you all for being here. The podcast will be available in the very near future, and I will talk to you all again next week. Until then, he said, holding up his Marauders map mug, which has now gone perfectly black. Mischief managed. Take care, everyone.